Is this the latest we've ever recorded an intro?
Probably.
Yeah. Definitely
depending on time zones.
Yeah. I mean, we're in Mountain Central.
Mountain, yeah.
So we're 2 behind Eastern. This releases at 5 a.m. This is within 12 hours.
It's 9:25 p.m. right
now. Which means it's 2 hours past. It means it's like 11. It's like 6 hours before it's going to come out. This has got to be the closest to the line we've ever done it.
How pissed is Lundy right now?
He's not thrilled.
Yeah.
He's not thrilled.
Sorry, Lundy.
But also, like, par for the course.
Yeah.
He knew what he was getting himself into.
Yeah.
Yeah. Brodrick Chavez, probably one of the most requested guests.
A lot of good feedback.
I think so, yeah. Mike Van Wyck is up there, but Broderick has definitely made a splash.
Yeah.
Sharp tongue, Broderick.
Yeah.
Sharp tongue.
Very.
You got to be on. And I got to tell you something. I tried and it wasn't. Recorded this right coming off a plane, 14-hour flight.
Ooh, that's
right
rough.
into a conversation with Brodrick Chavez. Thank God we got the first one out of the way and we're friends.
Okay.
Because I think he gave me a little bit of leeway on this.
All right.
And I kind of told him, I was like, bro, it's like, I'm hurt, man. Like, you don't go for the throat. And we kind of came up with this idea where the first one was about drugs. This one is, well, they're all going to be about drugs. Let's just get that out of the way. But this one is more about drugs and training. And Broderick has some really interesting takes on training, as he seems to have interesting takes on everything.
Yeah.
So we dug a little bit into his training history and how it basically everything is going to make the assumption that when he talks about training or next podcast will be about nutrition, that this is for people on drugs. He expresses, and it's worth a listen just to get Broderick's opinion on people who don't take drugs. So do enjoy the episode. If you are of the drugged persuasion, Team Evil GSP has a member site now. And if you're going to take drugs, know what you're taking first. Like back in the days, like forums were probably how you learned about taking drugs. And let's just say plenty of casualties from that. Like, blood's on your hands if you don't go learn about this shit before you decide to dabble. And Broads is the dude when it comes to learning about it. So teamevilgsp.com. While we're at it, Vivo, Barefoot. Australians. I think I want to talk directly to Australians because they're the people who don't like to wear shoes. And I get it. That's why we wear Vivo Barefoots. For the first month where we worked together, Vivo didn't extend their promo code to Australians. We sorted that. Boys at RX Radio, a.k.a. Junta, sorted out RX promo code for everyone in Australia, for their Australian distributor. So www.vivobarefoot.com/RX'D.
Yep, that's it.
Right? Promo code's on the website, 15% off your first pair. We're going back to the negotiating table. We're going to try and pull you a better deal moving forward. Great training shoes. You've been wearing yours a lot here in Edmonton.
I'm a big fan, yeah. Not Edmonton, the shoes.
Yeah, no, Edmonton is terrible.
Yeah.
Edmonton has to be the shittiest. I would put it top worst city in Canada. It's up because like, Van's got drug addicts, but it's also Vancouver. It's gorgeous. Like you can just look like, oh, I'm just going to look at a mountain instead of a heroin junkie. Yeah. But here it's just like you don't have a choice.
Yeah, it's just junkies.
It's been eye-opening. But I'll tell you what's not shit. Vivo Barefoot. www.vivobarefoot.
It's got to be the best ad for Vivo yet.
The best part is I don't think they listen to these.
No, they
just look at the statistics. So thank you guys for allowing us to offer the worst advertisements possible and still keep our sponsors. So that's it. Brodrick Chavez team, evilgsp.com, member site, Vivo Barefoot, vivobarefoot.com/RX'D. And don't go to Edmonton.
Yeah.
Lundy, hit it.
You're tuned in to RX Radio.
So the appetite for this level of information, do you think it's stemming from like a necessity to know it? Like we're seeing the consequences of how people are approaching, and I don't want to talk all about drug use. We want to get into some training stuff today, but do you think it's stemming from the consequences that are manifesting from going in blind of using these substances?
I really wish it was that. I wish it was a fear of mortality and those sorts of things. But honestly, I think the mortalities actually drive the interest in the drug use. And then it's just an arms race to see who can get the best programming and the coolest strategies.
Yeah, because that's an interesting one. I've started to notice that deployment strategies. I've paid more attention to the way people address drug use, and I paid more attention to just about everything since we spoke last, mostly the words I use in a sentence and how those words create syntax and how I might be saying things incorrectly or not relaying the point that I need. So thank you for so abruptly pointing that out, much to the benefit of everyone that listens to our podcast. Is like, oh, this is why we're easily the most requested guest upon dropping an episode. So, but all that aside, from a drug use standpoint, and again, I don't want to harp on this, do you feel like the driving the conversation is starting to change the paradigms at the top level? Because I feel like it's a trickle-down economics thing where someone hears about a bodybuilding coach that deploys X at 8 weeks out, Y at 6 weeks out, Z at 4 weeks out, and so on and so forth. Do you feel like that's starting to change at the top level, or is it just, do you find that it's more or less this information just reaching individual use cases and they're approaching things a little bit differently?
The honest truth is, my experience is the top level guys always have and always will have and do things that the middle and lower level guys do not. What I think changes is twofold. One, there's a certain fad to drug use. There's the, relatively low carb thing. There's a relatively high carb thing. There's, drop GH, don't drop GH. So the look changes. And then even if the middle and lower tier people don't know what has happened, they know something has happened because the look is different. Someone comes along and you're like, holy shit, what are they doing? Then my phone rings. What are they doing? How do I look like that person? And sometimes I know what it is specifically and sometimes I don't. So then it's just kind of a guessing game of deconstruction and kind of, how do you get a round peg into a square hole kind of fucking problem.
I want to look at this conversation from the other side of the aisle. About because let's look at input and output. Let's look at last podcast, talking a lot about input, what's going into the body, the different, not necessarily even categorization of drugs, but the different uses of drugs based off trends or what's in vogue at the time. What about on the training side, the output side? The longer I've done this and the more advanced a person I talk to, the less I seem to think that the training matters. Outside this door right now, there's, I don't know, probably 3 or 4 guys that are going to be going to the Olympia this year. And I, with all my book learnings and that, can go out there and be like, well, I don't know, maybe. But then I feel stupid because they're huge. So the longer I'm around this, I'm like, does the training matter? I'm going to say 3 things. What are the 3? Muscle damage, metabolic stress, and mechanical tension. When you think about muscle hypertrophy, how often do those 3 things cross your brain?
They do, but they do in almost an incidental fashion. It's
so
very
as a byproduct
difficult to lift a weight and not have those things happen. It's right. Bordering on impossible. It's a consequence of fundamental physics. Therefore, really all of this high learning nonsense is really get in your head, gravity's an up and fucking down affair. Get on with it. That's about it. The only time I can look at something in the gym and go, that is unequivocally fucking stupid, is when I see people moving horizontally against a fucking vertical force. The assholes with a plate between their hands doing this shit. Other than that, if the weight is going up and down, there's loading. Therefore, there's mechanical tension. Do that long enough, there'll be metabolic waste and damage. Take drugs, eat food, take naps, fucking repeat, fucking repeat, fucking repeat. It's done.
Now, does this change? Because part of that was, and it's weird because I spent more than half my day talking about the nuances and intricacies of the lines of exercise and the pull and the force and the fulcrums and all that shit. But even when I train, I'm like, and I'll train with people, I'm like, shut up, nerd. Shh. Does the game change when people aren't on drugs?
I don't know. I don't care.
Oh, now if you understand,
I don't like naturals. I don't approve of what they do. If they all collectively died of dick cancer, I would literally giggle. I don't give a fuck.
I'm almost afraid to ask the question because I feel like the answer is in the question itself. But let's say at the collegiate level, having an understanding that most people at the pro level training for some sort of
as a collegiate athlete. That's just wasted time. Go fuck yourself.
Okay. All right. Do you feel like we're moving towards a world where there's going to be an acceptance over this? Like people just kind of pull their head out of their ass and like, yo, everyone's on drugs anyways. We might as well. Or,
That is an interesting conversation, in my opinion. I don't get interested by a lot at this point. As much as I despise them as a group of subhumans, the cannabis crowd has proved to me that if you just blatantly ignore the rules long enough, they will change the rules to accommodate you.
interesting. Yeah, I mean,
that is literally what the cannabis crowd did. They just won by attrition. They're just like, we are not going to stop doing this. Criminalize us until we're all criminals. And then finally, legislators went like, holy fuck, like 70% of the world is criminal. We might want to rethink our strategy. And now you're seeing a decriminalization. And I sincerely believe it was just attrition. So maybe.
It's odd that other drugs are on the chopping block for decriminalization before anabolic steroids. The idea that isn't in Oregon, can't you like get meth in Oregon?
Yes.
Yo, like that's a problem.
Quiet news that a lot of people don't get as actually steroids were in that as well. Their testosterone and anabolic steroids are decriminalized in Oregon. There's basically no illegal drugs in said state.
Okay, so then you feel like that will start to maybe springboard into other states adopting that legislation?
Probably.
Okay, interesting. Now, let's, I don't want to drag you too much into the natural world to which you despise, but what are, if nothing matters in training, let's maybe look at your training. If you're to organize a training session or exercise selection, things along those lines, do you have a guiding set of principles? Because I can't imagine that you are nihilistic about this and you would probably think deeply as you think deeply about everything.
Interestingly, I do. But again, it's sort of the difference between sitting around thinking about high-minded physics or, cosmology or something. It's one thing to have a weird, multi-dimensional thought in your head, and then it's a much different thing to be like, well, how do I fucking prove that? I can't. So it was just an interesting thought, and then you go about your normal, real-world Newtonian, bullshit. So I do think about these things, and I've gone out of my way on a staggering level to expose myself to the people, Dr. Fred Hatfield, Maruji Pasquale. I just sit here and name names forever. It says ass game, and then like the mirror image of that is I have a deep connection and communication in the past with Arthur Jones, Gary Jones, Ellington Darden, Wayne Westcott. We'll momentarily shelve the idiot Menser twins, but those sorts of people. They weren't twins; they were brothers. But
and we could bring the meth thing up. That's a good segue.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think, amphetamines and weight training are exactly where you want to go with your fucking life choices. But fucking handful of methamphetamine and an apricot and call that your contest prep. It's fucking fantastic. But I've gone out of my way to, guys like Ed Cohn and Kirk Karwoski, Mark Chalet, so I've got a really broad, quite literally broad spectrum of influences. And you're right, there are certain unifying, abiding by gravity, abiding by recovery. But beyond that, there's really not a hell of a lot of commonalities because, quite honestly, it just doesn't seem to actually matter. And then on top of that, most people have their nose against things. I don't want to sound superior, but I go way out of my way to not do that. Sometimes to the point of being so far away, I have an almost embarrassingly generalized view. And all I see it is a continuum. If you're going to train very, very heavy, you're not going to do a lot of reps. If you're going to do a lot of reps, you're not going to do a lot of sets, and so on and so on. And there's just some of these really kind of obvious continuum-based things. If you're only going to do 5 sets of workout, you're probably going to train every day. If you're going to do 50 sets of workout, you're probably not going to train every day. And those sorts of things. And I really believe, and honestly, I'll mention a dozen times in a conversation about training how I despise the ledger book mindset. And I will come to that because I actually have something that I'll tell you of value. But I do think somewhere in the sky, next to the, invisible man with a beard, there is an actual ledger book. And in some format, you have to put enough hashes on the ledger to add up to what you want. Whether you do it in singles or sets of 20, whether you do it with 30% 1RM or 100% 1RM, eventually you need to fill in enough hash marks to equal what you seek.
Because I look at that same continuum of like trying to, and I don't think I'm capable of pulling myself as far back as you are and looking at it, because I think I'm too pressed up against it. But somewhere between the ledger book being like 4 sets of 12 lat pull down, it's like, really had to write that down? How much other shit do you need to remember? Like the 3 days you've done it last. But I look at like, by the time I start losing the horizon, when I'm at tonnage. When I get to tonnage as a training principle, I was like, oh, okay, well, we might be zoomed too far back. So my bookends of nuance exist somewhere between tonnage per session and 3 sets of 12 with a tempo written down and all that. So it's somewhere in there, and I don't know where.
But the interesting thing about tonnage, and this is one of those things like the really high frequency thing, that was taken from Olympic lifting. And in the context of Olympic lifting, it makes enormous sense, because in the context of Olympic lifting, every exercise is basically the same exercise. It's all rotation at the hip axis, the extension of the traps. It's all the same shit. Whether you're doing a clean or a snatch or a high bar squat or a front bar squat, it's fucking knees, hips, and traps. It's the same shit. So you can amalgamate that into one ledger because it's the same shit. That's the problem, is bodybuilders seem to believe they're the only people that lift weights, when in reality, they're the actual smallest subset of people that lift weights.
But wouldn't the specificity of that use case make it not transferable to, a push, pull, arms, shoulders, delts, lats, hamstring split?
Well, it absolutely would. But my point is, the tonnage concept works perfectly if you're talking about the 4 fucking exercises that are relevant to Olympic lifting.
Right.
That's the problem with bodybuilders, is they will take ideas that really don't belong to them, and more importantly, shouldn't belong to them, and they try to shoehorn their goofy, Flex Magazine world into this pre-existing, very nuanced, well-thought-out thing, and they wind up with some ugly fucking mess.
I think a good dovetail off that is failure. Like defining failure, training to failure. Oh, we've lost him. Oh, God. Quick, shock him back to life.
Oh, my fucking God. I don't want to speak as if I'm the final arbiter of these things. I am not. But as I mentioned, I have literally, in person, shared a cup of fucking coffee with the progenitors of that idea. Not the 3rd, 4th, 5th hand. I went to a seminar and I saw Mike Metzer tell me. No. I've actually sat at a coffee table and talked with Gary Jones about how his father came to the realization about failure. Okay. Here's the interesting thing, or perhaps not. You have to be, clever to realize what is and isn't fucking interesting. That excises about 85% of the people that might come into this conversation. But I digress-ish. The idea of failure was a logical precept. Arthur Jones realized that somewhere on a continuum existed a threshold of stimulus. He realized that no exercise generated no results. So that was not an acceptable answer. Then he realized somewhere along the application of effort, there was a trigger for stimulus, much like sun tanning. If you go out in the sun for 2 minutes, you don't get a 2-minute tan. You get no tan. The same thing, if you go out in the sun all day, you burn like a fool. Somewhere in the middle is you got enough sun for a tan, but not enough to be dead. There's a threshold. With that logical concept, Jones realized, I lack the acumen. It was a measurement of humility. I lack the acumen to decide exactly where that line is. Therefore, the only logical explanation, the only logical maneuver is to train to absolute failure, which is the only logical precedent that demands you pass that line. I have stimulated growth, maybe too much, but I definitely did it. Whereas if I stop at 63% or 72 or whatever the fuck arbitrary number, RPE, any asshole, if you stop at some arbitrary number, you may not have crossed that line and therefore not stimulated whatever you were seeking, therefore wasted your time. So Jones' concept of failure wasn't some biological genius idea. It was a logical consequence of humility.
Sticking with the tanning analogy quickly, you use the phrase overstimulate hypertrophy. What is the equivalent metaphorical consequence of getting burned by doing too much to failure?
Well, fair enough. Let's say your goal is to get a suntan as fast as possible. Right. Avoiding a suntan is the first step, because if you go out today and tan and burn, now you are literally not required but necessitated to stay out of the sun for 3, 4, 5, 6 days. Whereas if you stimulate a tan, you might be able to return quite literally the next day, or certainly and every other day. So simply the amount of exposure per unit time is higher if you don't cross said threshold into peril. I mean, this is Hans Selye shit circa 1920. This is not like high science.
So it'd just be the simple constraint of overall volume at the threshold of failure. Like how many times you're knocking on that door is probably going to be the one useful, or not the one, but a metric you should categorize as useful in your training. Like if you do 18 sets of failure.
I only see failure useful for 2 points. Now, admittedly, just the other day, there was a video posted of me training with Juji where we trained like absolute assholes for no goddamn reason. But the relevant and salient point there is just what I said. There was no reason. We did that because it was fucking funny, which is an awful lot of how I conduct my life at this point. I do shit because it's fucking funny, not because I have a burning desire to hypertrophy this or set record that or what the fuck ever. So that completely aside, the only real relevant use in my mind for failure is measurement. If you load the bar with, I want to put 150 kilos on and see if I can do more repetitions than I could once in the past, the only way to do that is to do it to failure, so you have equalized measurements, i.e. the scientific method. Beyond that, I don't think there's any real value in training to failure.
I don't know how to interpret that, because that is doing more and driving more stimulus, like showing up every day and doing like the little bit more tan every other day and being more tan at the end of the week than getting burnt like an asshole on Monday and not being able to go to the sun until the following Monday. That seems like the name of the game of progression. And ironically enough, no, please indulge me, sir.
Interesting. Completely off topic, but very, very relevant to this conversation. During World War II, worker productivity was one of the most important topics worldwide, both to the Allied and the Axis. Getting the most amount of shit built with the least amount of labor was paramount to winning the war, any war for that matter. Just so happens during World War II, there was a lot of organization. Governments were particularly mechanistic and did a lot of measurements. So universities were tasked to the idea of study worker productivity. Interestingly, later came up again and again in the Cold War for communism, but not relevant to this. That's a social commentary on a scientific concept. But anyway, one group in the UK thought that maybe lighting within the factory would have a relevant impact on worker productivity. So they measured the luminosity of varying factories and then strategically elevated the luminosity. And lo and behold, they found with each quanta of brightness, they got more worker productivity. So they immediately went, aha, brightness. The brighter it is, the better workers get. So they turned up the dial, saw a notch. Turned up the dial, saw a notch. And then eventually they reached a limit where brighter did not help. They turned it up more. Brighter made it worse. Ooh, okay. So their immediate red flag was, we figured it out. We have the threshold for perfect productivity. Just to double check themselves, they realized, well, if we turn it down, we should see commensurate reductions like the escalation. But lo and behold, they didn't. With each notch downward, they saw another uptick in productivity. What they realized after much to do, the change was the stimulus, not the direction of the change. And so they came up with a system of waving brightnesses and reductions that kept productivity at peak output. It's not infinite. You can't just produce forever. But every time productivity was about to fall off, they would change in a direction and it would correct the problem.
So they, if I may, they west-sided productivity.
100%.
Oh, I love it. Now,
Which, by the way, kind of sheds some light on how and why their revolutionary whatever the fuck wasn't that revolutionary. It was a cobbled together bunch of shit that had been figured out, I don't know, in 1945. But anyway.
I always thought the West Side model would have been better for strategic chaos in hypertrophy training rather than strength. That always, I mean, obviously the introduction of squat suits and stuff like that probably muddies the water a little bit on how those adaptations or stimulus is landing.
Correct.
But because the top of the top, it does just seem like novelty is the desired stimulus, is something new, not something progressive.
100%. And everything that we've seen, both in textbooks and in practical application, verifies that. It's just that it's difficult and novel and not changed hyper frequently, but sufficiently frequently enough to maintain the novelty.
What would the time horizon? What is the time horizon in your mind that would constitute hyper frequency of changing stimulus? Like, go in every day and go, oh, let's do this machine, and not have a standard or an understanding of like, oh, well, I do 35 pounds on this machine and 80 pounds on this machine. Is it a week? Is it a month? Is it 4 weeks? Is it?
That's a very good question, but I think a better question would be, first, what constitutes novelty? What magnitude of change constitutes a change? I think that's a much better question. And I think that's actually where people went apeshit. Like the West Side, we're going to scrap this exercise and do something entirely new, a new bar, a new box, a new thing. When in reality, from a physiological point of view, novelty could literally be doing 8 reps instead of 10 or 6 reps instead of 8 with no other change.
But doesn't this, and this is what gets me, doesn't this open up the door now to nuance, right? Like if the difference between a cable bicep curl and a dumbbell curl is a slight alteration of the strength curve superimposing over a resistance profile, where is the line now? How broad is that target to elicit new stimulus?
But again, that's the problem. I think the line is so broad that it's almost useless, because before changing exercises, you could literally just change rep range or change tempo or change rest period or change the day of the week you do it or the time of the day you did it or the song you're listening to in your fucking headphones while you do it. The amount of subtlety in change is the thing people aren't considering. For instance, people talk about, the bench press, like, oh, I stopped doing bench press and I do machine press or dumbbell press or incline, whatever. How about just move your grip 1 finger, change nothing else? That's technically a new exercise. Now, it's not wildly different, so probably the amount of runway you have within that novelty is shorter, but it's still different.
I struggle because to me, I like the nuance. How would you?
I wildly understand that you, me, and everyone else like something. But the reality is science doesn't give a fuck about our likes, and it is what it is. Now, we can still model our world based on our worldview like we do, but that doesn't change the reality of when you really sit down and make a list, most of what we're fretting over isn't real.
So if you had to draw a line outside, like with exercise selection, categorizing like high priority tools that achieve novelty. Time, rest periods, density would be up there, I'm assuming.
Absolutely.
Relative intensity, proximity to failure.
Absolutely.
And very subtle variation in exercise selection. Would that probably be, would subtle variation not in selection, but in execution, would, in your mind, would subtle variation in exercise execution, what's that?
I would also put patterning on that list. Let's say you have 3 exercises in a workout. High bar squat, leg press, and leg extension. Well, like the lottery, you have 3 digits that you can almost infinitely interchange into different combinations. There's extension, squat, leg press. There's squat, extension, leg press. You could keep flipping them around forever, and every change is, well, the key word in that sentence was change. That's novelty.
Right. So exercise organization.
Yeah, I would call that patterning, but same concept.
So you don't see something, and I don't have a dog in the fight, but with the nuance and exercise execution now, you don't see that being anything other than a tool of load management.
No, that's not fair. It is probably predominantly that, but it also serves another thing, which is thumb sucking. It gives people something to friddle with. It gives them a focus to their ADD, simple-minded, porn and Xbox attention spans, which is valuable. I'm not even criticizing it. But it's not the value that they believe it is. It's not that if you're perfectly supinated with an elbow and then you stick out your pinky, no, it's just now you're paying the fuck attention, and that has value.
Now, there's always 2 conversations that come up about like the hyper specific setup, stabilization, execution crowd, and then like the Ronnie Coleman crowd, right? Where it's like, he's squatting 800 for 2, however many days out from whatever show. Is there a difference in response to the polar ends of volume intensity training styles, like the Dexter Jackson to the Ronnie Coleman? You could speculate collateral with Ronnie and his back issues and Dexter still competing up to a late age. Is there a difference?
Well, there absolutely is, but I would also point out something, and I have this kind of emotional love-hate relationship with Ronnie Coleman because I have somewhat spoke disparaging of him in the past, but not as a bodybuilder, as a human. And I know that probably makes it more horrible, but it's still true. He's the greatest bodybuilder that's ever walked the fucking earth. There's zero ability to disparage that. Okay? Greatest physique ever for the longest duration ever. Full stop. His intellect, his character, some other things can be criticized, as can we all. So, okay. The thing I would say about Ronnie is most people wildly mischaracterize his training. Grab one of his DVDs and just pop it in and start watching it. And first of all, everything comes down to language. You need to have definitions of things. So these are my definitions, but you could make up your own and the game would still apply. I personally define a set as heavy if I can only or choose only to perform 5 or less repetitions. That is how I define heavy. Not the load on the bar, not the load comparison to some other person, but if I only do 3 reps, goes in the heavy category. If I do 6 to 12, I define that as moderate. If I do more than 12, I define that as light, regardless of the load. I can personally squat, 200 kilos for more than 12 reps. So to me, 200 kilos is defined as light, or can be defined as light, whereas other people may not be able to do 200 kilos for a single rep. So this is a personal thing. It's defined by repetitions performed. If you apply that structure in some fashion, watch Ronnie's videos, at least 50% of the sets he performs are moderate. Probably 25% are in fact light. And only 25% fall into the heavy category. So in reality, what the fuck's the difference? The difference is mechanically, because of origins insertions, lever lengths, fulcrums, etc., Ronnie just happened to use much greater loads in his light, moderate, and heavy concept.
It would almost be like using a nutrition analogy where you're looking at the calories over the grams over the calories. Where it's like if someone's bigger and they eat, it's still protein, carbs, and fats. It's the same distribution of light, moderate, and heavy, but you're just looking at the grams or kilograms in this case, rather than looking at the relative percentage to what this person needs.
100%.
So what about like on like the flip side, and I feel as if I know the answer already, but the Dexter Jackson side, where you never see him squatting, you never do. He always seemed as if he was contained by exercises that weren't loadable, right? Like he didn't really go into exercises that you'd frequently, like no one's ever done a quad extension for 4 reps. So has he ever lifted by that definition heavy if he doesn't go into the volume threshold required to lift heavy?
Very possibly not. And obviously that's not a big deal.
So we can put that in the
Mr. Olympia title.
Right.
So,
yeah.
So that kind of comes back full circle to the intro to this conversation, that all of these very interesting, definable, quantifiable concepts might actually matter just about less than the air that was used to speak them. Right.
So other than density, other than seemingly strategic variation, now maybe that's a bifurcation of the conversation that we can look. Is there an advantage to strategic novelty versus sporadic chaotic novelty? Like I will do this exercise for 4 weeks and then I will switch to this exercise, or I will move my finger grip in whatever.
I've made this argument and it has offended people. And honestly, I think of all the things I say, this is probably the most benign, but I have said consistently and rigorously that I think that's an emotional concept. I think there are an assortment of emotional phenotypes out there, and there are people such as myself, or at least as I would define myself, as a grinder. I actually don't like change. It almost bothers me to, for instance, prep for an event because I have to change what I'm doing, and I like what I'm doing. And so I think that how often you change or how big the change is or even what style of training you have an affinity to, I think is mostly determined by your emotional phenotype, not some biological necessity.
So it would be more so like the sustainability of whatever the framework is over time probably has more to do with it than, hey, this guy likes to go in the gym and go, oh, let's do this, and this today, and then putting him in a rigid structure that he doesn't like. Probably better off having him do the thing that he can do today and do in 10 years.
Buy-in. It literally comes down to buy-in. If you buy into the system and you like the system, you're going to apply the system. And therefore, if it meets those couple of basic things we laid out in the beginning, it's going to work. Even if it's an inferior process, if you apply it superiorly, probably going to work better.
That's the issue I have with the recent trend of I'd call them neuromuscular electrical stimulation devices. I think they have a clever term for them. These electrodes that people are putting on while they're training. Like at a certain point, buy-in has to have a diminishing return to the actual stimulatory effect of what it is they're buying into, right? There has to be, this has to be contained. What in common practice do you think falls on the outer borders of things that people buy into that could potentially be detrimental, so much so that they're more detrimental than the positive attributes that come with buy-in to begin with?
Well, goofy things like you mentioned, electrostim, probably occlusion training, possibly site injection, a number of those types of things. But those, again, they're as you define them, they're relatively speaking fringe type things.
Now, if you were to organize, like, let's say you were 25 years old, you're in the running for Mr. Olympia, you've qualified. It's, I don't know, we're October, September right now. It's early December. How would you organize your training? And I'm sure you probably had these conversations with competitors in this exact position. What is your advice from a training perspective You kind of gave a brief sort of elevator pitch
you're
of it.
talking specifically about high-level bodybuilding.
Yeah. And then maybe we can start to parse out differences as we move into general population, athletic sports, things like that.
Quite honestly, I find bodybuilding a really, really fascinating sport because, one, it's actually not a sport, it's a pageant. And two, because it's not a sport, the thing you do to progress in a sport has absolutely nothing to do with winning the sport. You lift weights to build a physique, but the competitive part has nothing to do with weights. There's no weights anywhere involved. That's a really interesting thing. Imagine a sport that requires you to run to train for it, but there's no running in the sport. That would be really weird. Bodybuilding's a truly unique animal. Okay. Because of that, when I am preparing a bodybuilding package, and I say package because occasionally I will do just pharmacology or just training or even just nutrition. But when I'm preparing a package, a cohesive, integrated concept of all the things one needs to do, the closer you get to the event, 100% unequivocally universally, the less important workouts become. The more important cardio becomes, the infinitely more important nutrition becomes, with drugs at the absolute top as the most important thing. So if you thought of it as, kind of a graph, the pharmacology is, arcing up particularly high, nutrition's below that but above the other two, cardio's more important or progressively more important than training, and training's bordering on unimportant and probably tapers to borderline nothing at the very end.
So if someone were to look to hire you and be like, well, you offer these a la carte services, would you prioritize them that way? Like, look, if you really want physique development, these are probably the biggest things that will impact it: pharmacology, nutrition, cardio, and then training at the bottom.
Well, again, that's contest prep. That might not be all season. There's
right.
Cardio is obviously not more important than weight training in the off season. It's still very, very important, but those two, for instance, would be flipped.
Can you think of a use case where training starts to creep up outside of bodybuilding, like in general athletics, in sports, in track and field?
100% in real block periodization. You have an MMA fighter or something, there might be this very, very off-season just kind of GPP scenario where cardio is the most important thing because we're just trying to develop enzymatic and, baseline health, improve, energy efficiencies, those sorts of things. Then, depending on the opponent, for instance, what things you must prioritize to prepare for that particular fight, a coach may come to me and go, fighter X must be stronger to do for this next fight, at which point we apply the fundamentals of strength training with progressive overload in fundamental movements, and that becomes the most important thing for a block of time. Then we take that strength, and by the way, using Eastern European principles, because we're using block periodization, where we are going to abandon, wild exaggeration, but for the language, abandon a thing and move into another thing, we actually need more of it. So if the goal is, say, raise the given squat from 100 kilos to 130 kilos, we'll actually go to 150 kilos. So that when we abandon it, the regression is to land at the target, which is the actual target.
Right. Plate spinning.
Eastern Europeans used to call the 120% rule. They always trained for 120% of an outcome so that when they abandoned a thing, they were sure to have 100%.
When you're dealing with athletes at the highest level, I think we can all agree, especially based off our last conversation, that performance-enhancing drugs are probably going to be involved for a certain duration of time to a certain level. When we went through the bodybuilding comparison and we took out these four things for prep for a bodybuilding contest. We said drugs, nutrition, cardio, and training. Those are probably going to be the four main pillars of any athletic endeavors, regime.
I might consider, recovery, orthopedic management, an actual pillar in and of itself for many, particularly track and field or MMA type fighters or athletes.
Okay. So even with the inclusion of the fifth, does the relative high ranking of drugs start to change its magnitude on the result when the use of those drugs is not the Wild West and it has to be contained. When it's not bodybuilding and it can't be like blast
really,
and trend.
It's really more about drug testing at that point. When drug testing becomes relevant, you have hard stops because you just, it's like cheating on your taxes. There's a point where it's just too obvious.
I don't know. What are you talking about, Broderick? I have no idea. No one cheats on their taxes. Okay, so that when it becomes like titration over just stimulating until you're on the Olympia stage, that in itself starts to rank order different next to cardio and strength and recovery and
yes,
nutrition.
but there's an interesting reality there. Is contrary to what like the sort of the natural crowd believes. They'll say things like, well, I just want to reach my, I want to fulfill my genetic potential. When you're talking about an Olympia caliber bodybuilder, they're orders of magnitude above their genetic potential. So at that point, when drugs are no longer manipulable, so is everything else underneath of it. How can you train more without more drugs? How can you do more cardio without more drugs? How can you do any of that stuff without more calories? So at some point, it's really a moot conversation because the high order movers either move or they don't.
Right. So it's no longer like a tensegrity model where little pulls from other places are going to make changes over here. It's really just this leads from the front. The drugs are going to drive the input drives the output.
Yeah, 100%. If you lower the milligrams, you lower the recovery. That means by definition, one shall lower the stimulus in the other vectors. It's not one of these things where, oh, we could just pull together and train through it. No.
Yeah.
You
brought up an interesting point about drug tests. They, with the introduction of drug testing in the UFC, that was probably the most profound, as I think it's probably the most dangerous place to use performance enhancing drugs. You want to use drugs as you're only going to hurt you. It's only your kidney. It's not like if I blast a bunch of gear, Lundy's producer's liver is going to fall out or whatever the fuck.
Right.
What is the current in your mind, and this is very broad on purpose, what is the current state in your mind of the efficacy and effectiveness and maybe even the long-term prognosis of drug testing on the whole?
Well, universally, drug testing was a failed concept, poor implementation, and everything from there is downhill. I have an almost inexpressibly low opinion of both drug testing and the people who implement it. I literally think less of WADA than I do of, say, the Vatican. I really think they possess a phenomenally low stratum of the human genome. You have I harmed you? I'm sorry.
No, that was amazing. I didn't know where. I thought you may have done NAMBLA. I was like, he's going to do NAMBLA, the North American Man Boy Love Association, but he went with Vatican, and then it could kind of be the same thing. It was fucking brilliant. I loved it.
I apologize. I wasn't.
Please don't.
I apologize to you, not anyone who's religious. Fuck that.
Sorry, continue. The Vatican, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's no. It's a bureaucracy, and if you literally, I mean, going back to Dostoevsky and fucking Karl Marx and etc. If you look up the definition of a bureaucracy, it's a thing that seeks to perpetuate itself and nothing more. That's what that is. They want a job, so. By definition, they can't catch everyone because then they'd be out of a job. But in the same definition, they can't catch no one or they wouldn't justify their job. So their job is just to be there and be annoying, kind of like genital warts. They don't really do anything, but they're not very sightly. It's just a fucking annoyance. They serve zero purpose.
I think without putting too fine a point to it, they're a pain in the dick, literally.
That's
now,
pretty much where I was at. Yeah.
How do you play into, I guess, more to the bureaucracy side of things, when we do see athletes who test positive? Is this more of a political move? I mean, obviously, there's a myriad of reasons. Okay, because everyone is.
Consider this. Joe Biden just hired a bunch of tax agents. Literally, even unintentionally, almost certainly every single person that files taxes is guilty of some faux pas, some comma missed, some letter, something. The thing's just so infinitely complex that it's bordering on impossible and certainly improbable that everyone's 100% compliant everywhere all the time. So because of that, those agents can point to any human on the street and go, you failed. In defending yourself, you shall incriminate yourself. So that's the game. It's just a tool to keep you within a margin of not being such an outlier that they go, look, guy, come here. You're guilty. We know you're guilty, and we're going to tell everybody you're guilty.
There's a recent
Lance Armstrong. Every single person he competed against was equally or more guilty, but he was such a competitive outlier that he had to be the example.
Is there a sport? Let's go mixed martial arts, Major League Baseball, NHL, NFL, and NBA. Sort of like the big five that occupy North America. We'll leave soccer out of this. Is there a more egregious offender on the whole, do you think? Like, could you rank order those in order of drug use, regardless of type of drugs, whether it's anabolic, androgenic, cognitive, whatever?
No, because those sports are so broad. People love to do that. But the problem is, for instance, take American football. There's wild differences in positions.
Right.
A nose tackle versus a punter are bordering on separate species. So it's very, you could line up, all the quarterbacks and say, what's the drug use? It would be one number. But then you could line up all the linemen and it'd be a much different number. And then not only would the number of use cases be different, but the hierarchy of what's used would be wildly different.
Right.
Based on position and necessity of said position.
I was actually thinking of the other day, I was in the gym, I was back in Dubai, and I was talking to a guy who was competing in a natural show. Forgive him for his sins. And he told, and I was interested because I knew we were having this conversation. And I was like, how do they test? And he said, there's some sort of drug assay, and then there was also a polygraph test. In the scheme of does that, I don't know whether that's either super effective or as ineffective or more ineffective than the drug testing itself. How does that land in your mind as a way of testing people of taking performance-enhancing drugs?
Well, I hate to defer my opinion and give you someone else's opinion, but I think that many times that's a good move because I seem like I have a theme and I seem like I have an agenda. So to defer that agenda-based concept, two famous magicians, Penn and Teller, familiar with it a little bit? They had a TV show where they basically just went around debunking shit. One of the things they chose to debunk was a polygraph test. And they just took random assholes off the streets of Las Vegas and gave them a 5-minute tutorial on how to beat a polygraph test. And then they did.
Okay. All right. So even more ineffective than a drug test.
Yeah, but at that point, not only is it ineffective, but now you're testing actually a different thing. You're testing, are you a good liar? So rather than, are you taking drugs, it's, are you actually a sociopath? Which, newsflash, most athletes fucking are. So what? As far as testing itself, like the WADA, because I had a friend of mine, he was an Olympic weightlifter for super heavyweight. He was going to go up against Lasha in Brazil. Mm-hmm. And it's fairly public knowledge. So I don't feel like I'm outing him or anything. He did not compete. Now, mind you, he routinely comes in about second or third to Lasha, as Lasha is just inhuman. Mm-hmm. And he got popped 12 days before Rio at 4:30 in the morning in Brazil, where he's from. How easy is it or difficult is it to beat the test? Like, I don't even know how to. That's a much more nuanced question than you realize. It's very easy to beat the test. It's not easy to beat the test in such a way that it really holds a large amount of efficacy. You see what I mean there? There's a big difference. Can I give you a scenario where you can take drugs and pass the test? 100%. Literally with 100% success. But is it enough drugs to justify the effort? Is it enough drugs to justify getting a meaningful outcome? That's a different conversation. Taking enough drugs that are going to affect your placing, every place you move up is an order of magnitude of risk to failure.
Well, how do you interpret then the gold medalists? Are they just not getting tested? Are they or are they that genetically superior? Like someone like Lasha, like sticking with the example of
all of the above. They're genetically wildly advantaged. They probably have a much better organizational system behind them. They probably have a certain amount of inside, communication with the hierarchy that's doing the testing. They probably have people above that even looking out for them from a paperwork point of view. See the Ben Johnson schmaz. Turns out Carl Lewis probably failed the same fucking drug test, but that paperwork just happened to disappear. So it's probably factorial and multi-layered.
So do you feel bodybuilding on the whole is somehow ahead in the sense that it doesn't even bother to look? Do you feel like as
100%? So, I think literally its lack of testing makes it comically more honest to the actual outcome.
How much different do you think let's stick with a sport like football. How much more different do you think it would be if I can't imagine these guys getting any faster, right? So let's just say there's moderate drug use and moderate to the sense of no one's pulling these guys aside and be like, yo, could you tone it down a bit? Like, this is insane.
Right.
How much better does the outcome, let's go with football, how much better does that product get with more drugs?
Well, it's interesting because, again, your thinking is a bit too narrow. Pull back the lens. There's a lot of layers to better. Like novelty, there's a lot of subtlety. Would it make athletes faster? Probably not. Would it make athletes larger? Probably not. Linemen are pretty goddamn big. Would it make them stronger? Probably not much. But might it make them more resilient? Might it improve recovery times? Might it extend career lengths? Might it have seemingly nuanced but ultimately very relevant impacts to the outcome of the sport over time? Almost certainly.
Do you feel like that top-down chain, or that I don't even know if top-down is the right way to word it, because kind of doubling back to decriminalization, like what is the timeline for drugs, right? Psilocybin mushrooms was so quickly on the heels of cannabis legalization. And, countries like Portugal have decriminalized pretty much everything, to my knowledge. So do you feel like it's going to be, I look at hormone replacement therapy and its popularity now. Do you think it's going to be an outside-in filtration? I don't even know if that's the right word, but like as the general population starts to adopt these hormones on a more regulated basis, do you feel like that'll ultimately be the thing that pushes it over the line for pro sports? Like, look, Roger Goodell's on TRT. Maybe the linebacker for the Steelers should also be on it. Do you see a world, or how do you see that acceptance of like, look, guys, let's just give it up?
I don't know. On one hand, I think it's maybe sort of what you said, but maybe a little different. Again, I tend to have an agenda, and I confess that, and I tend to see usually the worst of humanity, not the best. I completely admit that, although I'm right and everyone else is wrong. I think on one hand, it will be more of that slippery slope kind of concept. The same ardent, steroids are evil, Joe Biden in fucking Congress talking down his fucking nose to professional baseball players, telling them quite matter-of-factly that he was a really good athlete, but the reason he didn't get to play pro sports is because other people were taking drugs. Like that floppy dick liberal dipshit has the right to insinuate himself into professional sports. Fuck him. Now, that same liberal floppy dick stratum are now octogenarians and their liberal dick is actually floppy, and they're looking for anything from the sky that will help them, and it turns out it's the same evil steroids that they were against. So I think that's the wedge that's going to open the door, is their own reality of necessity, that then others will force themselves through the door, making the opening bigger and bigger, so that eventually it's just a thing. That's my guess.
Do you feel like the base level understanding of steroids on the whole, as broad a spectrum as that is starting to come more from the scientific community now than it ever has? Because I feel like, it's still just... I
really don't. I think you hit it right on the head. I think it's more on the whole. I think the gay community and the porn community and et cetera, other communities that are far more interested in the whole are actually driving the advancement of these things.
Okay, all anal wordplay aside, I guess with the popularity of HRT and hormones, I can't say on the whole ever again in my life. Thank you for that, Brodrick. I guess, where do people, like, obviously you've aggregated this information about hormones to make informed decisions on what they do. And I think since our last podcast, the idea of side effect and effect that thought process has been very, very pervasive, I know, in my life. And I've had a bunch of people tell me, like, oh, things just do stuff. And I was like, exactly. Things just do stuff. And it's up for us whether they're good or bad. It's where do people even start? Right? Like I go into a gym, and much to your earlier point from our last podcast, and I look around and I go, oh, like 75% of guys in here are on drugs, and 100% of them have no idea what the fuck they're doing. What is the process in understanding? Because I feel like, to kind of circle this back, that is ultimately what pulls this into decriminalization, is to understand, like, I remember the after school special with Ben Affleck with a dart, and he just, like, I don't know what exists on this. Maybe it was the same thing, like check drops or something. He injected check, and he like throws his mom on the floor. But it's like, where does that understanding going to come from to
and then
decriminalize?
The comedy is that same actor then gassed up to be Batman.
Yeah, amazing. And in the Town was also shredded. Good for him.
Yeah.
But do you see, like, it's a chicken and the egg? I think the only way we get to a place where it's decriminalized is if it's understood. But we can't understand it if we're not doing the research.
I don't know if that's true. I mean, again, we're at a situation where cannabis and even potentially heroin's being decriminalized. But does even the above average user of those things know anything about them, really?
But how many times before the cannabis got decriminalized did you have to hear them referred to as cannabinoids and this very scientific leaning, podcast driven subtopic, subthread shit?
Yeah, I follow you. I absolutely understand your train of thought. And again, maybe I'm just too cynical. Maybe I'm just a curmudgeon. But I just think that's a vague veneer that's on the top that really doesn't have much to do with driving the actual zeitgeist. People do what they want to do, and all they need to do is be convinced that it's what they want to do. Yeah. It's like the current craze with microdosing psilocybin. The average idiot, even the average above average idiot, they don't know anything. They just know that apparently it's cool, and apparently cool people are doing it, and apparently I better try it. That's literally all they know. They don't know that you talk brain chemistry to the average person, and they just glaze over you. You might as well be reading them a phone book from Beirut. They don't know what the fuck you're talking about. So,
because my thing, heroin laws are not the thing that stopped me from doing heroin. Right? It's not like needle exchanges in Canada versus the States. It's not like, oh, I know what I'm going to do on Friday. Do you feel like the frequency of use would even increase in the general population or across the spectrum if it was made decriminalized?
Steroids, probably. Not an enormous amount, but probably.
More so than other decriminalized drugs?
Because use was, at least in the United States, use was like in the 70 percentile range. Like people of my generation, I'm a phenomenal outlier in that I don't, or at least I actually do now for pain and sleep. But I went 48 of my 50 years with zero cannabis use. That literally made me a 1 in 10, 2 in 10 outlier. So I don't think steroid use is that pervasive in the United States. So yeah, it probably would raise it a bit.
Interesting. Okay. Now, with your own personal research on steroids, how up to date do you need to stay with these things? Like, I feel like because the evolution is art. I don't want to say the evolution, but like because research really isn't coming in at a clip that you need to stay on top of this, and the mechanisms are the mechanisms.
That's the point. We're talking about technology circa 1935. Yeah. The wholesale, the patent for the creation of synthetic testosterone was 1935. We're talking about technology that's bordering on a century old. There's not a whole lot of up to date, folks. That's like trying to be up to date on, cement. Like, it's fucking cement. We know how to use it. Mix it up, build a building.
Yeah, and it's crazy to me that so many people use it. I mean, fuck, myself included, who don't really have an intimate understanding of what's going on, especially from an interaction standpoint with other drugs as well as just baseline physiology. So you're an interesting beacon of, like, because you are taking this stuff that is purely mechanistic, that is kind of cut and dry, that is binary 1 and 0, and you're sort of waving it like, hey guys, over here. And, the rest of society and Hands Across America and PTA groups across the world are kind of still demonizing it, but you're like, it is what it is. Do you feel any kind of pressure when you talk about it? Like, I was just in Singapore, for example, your name came up, and Singapore has particular, and they want to bring you in, but they don't even know how the government would respond to an open forum discussion about these types of things. Do you feel like an army with no country?
I actually had an interesting, I went to Norway. I try to say this without incriminating anyone, but a group in Norway wanted my presence for a seminar, a drug-driven seminar. But because of who they were and because of Norway, that was not possible in a commercial fashion. And they actually purchased my wife and I a vacation package and then booked themselves at the same locale. And every night for dinner, we had a collective dinner where we talk shop, just to skirt those sorts of things.
That's the only way I'm going to do seminars. If anyone wants to book me, it's Club Med or nothing. I'm not doing this gym shit with the whiteboard anymore. 5 stars or less. Well done, sir. Well done. Way to skirt. Way to win the game. Unbelievable. Now, I know there's a lot of people that listen who take drugs. Evil GSP member site is up. What access to what information can they get from the website?
Oh my God. I am the very worst salesman for my wares. I don't exaggerate. There's a shade over 1,000 hours of just Q&As, just this, me answering questions. There is over 1,000 hours of curated material, me chatting on a topic, another expert chatting on a topic. I've tried very hard to make it not just my voice. There are other people as well. For instance, were you to sign up, you're presented with this homepage. Top right corner, there's literally an icon that says start here. I would strongly recommend you do that. And if you do that, it will take you to what I call the practical application series, which leads you through step by step. Should you take drugs? Do you want to take drugs for the right reasons? Are you aware of what this is going to cost you legally, financially, physically? And then the very final 2 or 3 chapters are the actual, okay, here's drugs to take to start. But it's more than just the science of drugs. There's an awful lot of the social, cultural, and even financial concepts of what the fuck you're getting into. What's going to happen to you on levels. I don't know how many times people have kind of made this commitment to jump into drugs, and something, again, drugs do things do things, and they wind up with a divorce, not because they beat their wife, not because they quit their job, not because they burnt down the neighbor's house, but because they turned into a sexual predator and they were fucking romping their spouse like an entirely different person 8 times a fucking week, and that was intolerable. It's silly. It's a strange thing to bring up out loud, but yet it's a thing, and we got to talk about it. So
Yeah,
there's a lot of laundry that comes with this particular topic.
It's I feel like it's something that there's been a market for so long, like from forum days, and thank God forums are not, I mean, I guess Reddit is like the meta forum on the internet, but reading is, I remember reading articles on steroids when I was in my early 20s, and you know, a lot has progressed in the last decade, and you're looking back on it now with what little, almost to nothing I know, I'm like, oh my God, that was almost life-ending advice that, you know, Isaac 9000, this is not my total form, whatever the fuck his user handle was, who was a platinum contributor, was just giving you, and you're like, oh shit. So the aggregation of it, I think, even for someone to just be able to point someone in the direction, because I you know, for every, it's almost like the mass shooter, for every one baseball player kid who has a bottle of Winstrol and is just it bullies some kid, it's like, oh, it's the drugs. There's 10,000 people who go out there and somehow are able to luckily navigate their way to using these drugs with minimal effects, almost said side effects, minimal effects. And I think we could narrow that number even greater, because we're not going to stop people from trying it, right? I remember that line from Chris Bell's movie, Bigger, Faster, Stronger, where you asked, the one guy hypothetically poses the question of, if you had to take a drug with the known effects, I think he uses the word side effects, known effects of steroids to feed your family and support yourself, would you do it? And everyone said yes. So I think it's really interesting, even as if any fitness professional, to have a place to point people. Don't take my word for it. Take this aggregation, don't even take Broderick's word for it, because you are pulling from so many sources and so much experience and so much information. So, because like, I think, drugs are here to stay. They are. It's drugs, if nothing else, work, which is awesome. But knowing how, what, when, why, and who, I think is super important in just making them safe, which is something that in the last couple of years, it seems in the industry that we work in has not been on the front and center of people's minds. So I think it's an incredibly valuable service for those who are not interested in drugs, to be able to point those who are in the direction of, and if you are, definitely go hop on the website. And in person, you are also have, we were talking leading into this, you're in Orlando at the end of the year at the Olympia. You're in Australia, and then Australia, London, what's that say? I can't read the screen. I'm old. Australia. Oh my God. Geez, you're really making up for lost time here. I'm looking at your website as we speak. Phoenix, Las Vegas, Australia, just confirmed. And so this will be mid-October of next month. You'll be in Dubai. So I know a lot of friends in the Middle East. If you guys are around, it's Dungeon Gym in Dubai, if I'm not mistaken.
Dungeon Gym, I think is the title. Yeah.
Right. And then you'll be, like I said, end of the year. I might actually see you. I might see you in Orlando in October, and then I might actually be out in Las Vegas in December. So, Broderick, again, I appreciate you coming on as always. I'm glad we got to kind of steer more to the training side.
As disappointing as it might have been.
You know what? I think it's more so the sentiment that I've been echoing, because I do love to train, and I think it is just, figuring out what signal from noise I think is so useful. And I think more people just need to turn down the noise and focus on what really matters. So if a strong recapitulation, if a very blunt worded recapitulation is what they needed to hear, man, I think I agree, wholeheartedly with that, and obviously comes from a place of experience, and obviously have the knowledge. So I appreciate you again so much for taking the time, and hopefully see you soon. Good luck with the road trip and everything. Again, it's teamevilgsp.com. I got that right? Lundo, looking at you. Team Absolutely. Evil GSP. Yep. And so member site, and then you can sign up for the in-person seminars. Broderick, thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you.